I believe that's kind of what started this whole crisis and started to get the ball rolling, was this overprescribing of opioids to our community. If you don't know what it's like to be addicted to heroin, then you don't know. It is a constant 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job.
How someone does get hooked onto an opioid is important to do our best to normalize it.
The unfortunate part with chemical health, mental health, is that people look like me are substandard people in the eyes of people who give treatment.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Stories from the Field, a series of podcasts that dive into the issue of the evolving opioid epidemic in Minnesota. Our goal? Simple: to give voice to those who are or have experienced substance use disorder and to provide perspective into the issue.
Did you know opioids have been widely available in America since 1775? And by 1860, morphine was developed, which was derived from the opium plant and was highly addictive. Now, in this Stories from the Field podcast segment, we're going to dive into the history of opioid use, misuse, and how it developed into a crisis. So joining me today, University of Minnesota Medical School Assistant Professor of Medicine, Dr. Ryan Kelly. He's been helping treat those suffering from substance misuse, specifically with opioids. And we also have Jase. He's a case manager at American Indian Community Development Corporation. And it's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week shelter that is Native American culturally based. We're going to learn a little bit more about the facility and that work in just a bit. We also have joining us Dr. Peter Hayden. He's the founder of Turning Point, and we'll explain more about that organization in a bit. But first, thank you for joining me. Let's begin with the beginning, and let's describe, if you can, the evolution of opioids. Let's begin with Jase.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I like to note that from 2010 to 2019, there was 178% increase of opioid use in the Native American community that resulted in abuse. And that was taken from the recent report that I got from the Minnesota Department of Health. So starting with talking about the Native American community, I think is very respectful because we do get hit the hardest. And it's not just one generation, it's generational, right? So you have the older generation who got prescribed it more than likely from their doctor, and it was for like a pain or like a broken arm or whatever. And then they got cut off from that. In the meantime, while they were using it, so were some of their kids, right? So I remember as a kid watching my mom come home with big, huge bottles of Vicodin. I didn't know what that was at the time. I just knew that those pills were pretty freaking cool to sneak while she wasn't looking. And I know that other kids sneak pills too. And I believe that's kind of what started this whole crisis and started to get the ball rolling, was this overprescribing of opioids to our community. I know of communities that had clinics open and prescribe a bunch of tribal members prescriptions, right? And get people hooked basically on opioids. And then they either got shut down from overprescribing, they got caught, they got thrown in jail. That leaves a whole community left addicted to opioids. And these are whole reservations. This is families. And it wasn't, in my opinion, until it started making its way into the suburbs and started affecting white kids and white families. Then we started talking about like opioids and the abuse and like started coming up with like funding to help the communities. Meanwhile, the Native American community has been suffering with opioids for generations. It isn't anything new. It's just new to Minnesota because white people are being affected, in my opinion.
Dr. Kelly, would you agree with that?
I would 100%. The historical perspective of how different folks in different communities are impacted by opioids is super important to hear about the ongoing discrepancies in who is accessing care. And, I think exactly what Jay said. I've been a doctor, fully trained since 2013, and I didn't get waivered to prescribe, a medication that can help treat opioid dependence in 2016. And so that's right when, as Jay said, communities with more money, white communities started to get really national attention on the opioid epidemic. But just like what Jay said, there are other communities that have been impacted already for a generation at least. And so as a white provider myself, to only be coming to the table now, to try and start helping, I think is important to keep that in mind.
Dr. Hayden, can you provide for us the African American perspective on the issue of how opioids infiltrated these communities?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate you, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. Turning Point started because of my own drug use. Unfortunately or fortunately, I had the opportunity to meet drugs and alcohol at a long time ago when I was playing football. By doing so, it kind of relieved my pain only for a short period of time. Went through treatment about 48 years ago. Through going through treatments, it was very clear to me that in my community, and I say my community, I'm talking about people with the same color that I have, we were not being treated the same way. And so I started to talk to the community, the elders, the legacy people in my community, and said, here's what's happening to me. I went through this program, and I don't see a lot of people like me in the program, nor are they staying sober. And so my community came together. But if I can go back, Julie, for a minute, the unfortunate part with chemical health, mental health, is that people look like me are substandard people in the eyes of people who give treatment. Point in case, I'll use the street word heroin, but it's heroin. And it was also named black dust. It was named many street names in terms of how you dealt with it, what you wanted, and things of this nature. 50 years later or more, it's called opioids. And so the name changes, and so therefore the people who use the drugs don't change, but it's more of other people with this drug. And when you talk about opioids, now all of a sudden there's treatment for people who are using opioids. There are people who are recovering because of opioids. And then the last part is opioid sounds better, doesn't it? You know, if you were a heroin user or these kinds of things, then it just sounds better to be opioid addicted rather than heroin addicted, alcohol addicted, and these kinds of things. Substance that go into human beings' lives, and not enough people who look like me are having that opportunity. We're going to talk about it because I want to talk about it from the framework of African American and people of color. And by the way, I start looking, I always research things. And so I started looking back, and just as much as people of color was not being helped with heroin, opioids, et cetera, women are also in that group that unfortunately we're not being worked with in the same kind of way. And so that's why I started Turning Point. I said, it's time to stop. It's time to move forward with people. And there are people, and I'm skipping in a sense, but there are people who get concerned about why you got to talk about Black, Native, Hispanics and things of this nature. I have to do it because you won't do it. I don't get the same treatment when I'm trying to do the kinds of things that will help me and my people. And so that's why I opened Turning Point. And we have 6 locations, and we work with mental health, chemical health, and housing, and things of this nature. There was a book out by Dr. White, and what he said, and some people took him to court because they said he was racist. And he said, how can I be racist if all I want to do is please my people too?
But to answer your, go ahead, Julie. Go ahead. How someone does get hooked onto an opioid is important to do our best to normalize it, to be able to get past the bias many of us face when it comes to someone choosing to do a drug or choosing to do a behavior. And so, the spiel I tell other medical providers who are less experienced in addiction than I am, I talk about the road to heroin, and this road can impact anyone. Let's say, your aunt has surgery and gets prescribed, a couple weeks worth of painkiller and doesn't get a lot of education on how dangerous this painkiller is if you take it more than a week or two. Your aunt, gets discharged from the hospital, improves, gets back to work, but then runs out of the pain medication. So then your aunt goes to see their surgeon and gets prescribed one more week, but they're kind of told, hey, this is a slippery slope. You can get addicted. So here's 1 week. That's it. Your aunt's still working. Then your aunt runs out. So she's on the phone with her brother who lives nearby, and he luckily has some Dilaudid, another opioid left over from his gallbladder surgery. So he shares it with her, and she's able to keep functioning. But then her brother runs out, and so it's Friday night. She's feeling miserable. She doesn't know exactly what's going on, but she knows what she needs to feel normal. And her brother can't think of anything till he realizes that they haven't, their cousin sometimes sells marijuana. Maybe their cousin knows someone, and their cousin's able to get their hands on some oxycodone, another prescribed opioid that lasts a week or two. Well, then their cousin, her cousin can't find any more of that. But luckily, he's got something that's cheaper. The problem is you have to snort it. It's a powder, but it kicks in faster and it lasts longer. And like I said, it's cheaper. But over time, you get tolerant to that. And so it's cheaper to inject it. And so that road to heroin impacts everyone. And whether you are in a rural community, whether you are in a community where every time you go see a doctor and you're in pain, it's assumed that you're drug seeking, whether you are able to get prescribed opioids for a short time before a doctor or a medical provider cuts you off, in the end, the addiction hits everybody. Everyone who takes opioids for more than 2 to 3 weeks can get dependent on them.
Jase, I'd like to circle back with you too. You talked about what was happening with this overprescribing of opiates. What happened when those prescriptions stopped? Do people on the reservation tend to fall back to heroin, or do they order things online, get some illicit drugs from the streets? What do you find the pattern to be?
I believe like what Dr. Ryan just talked about was pretty much, step by step. Like I've seen that same scenario like play out time and time again. And it's quite shorter. It's basically the cost. It's a lot cheaper to get heroin than it is to buy pills from a dealer. Like if I go to a dealer, I'm going to pay out my nose for a couple pills compared to heroin. It's a lot cheaper. So that's one thing. And like, if you don't know what it's like to be addicted to heroin, then you don't know kind of what you're talking about, because like it is a constant 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job, because you need to stay ahead of it, and so you don't come down. So it feels like you have the flu. Like the flu 24/7, it doesn't stop. At least with the flu, you can take some medicine, it can kind of go away for a little bit. This is constant, and it constantly is on your head and your brain. It affects your body, and it's all you can think about. I know this for a fact. I was an IV drug user for many, many, many years, and I tried heroin, and it brought me to my knees within a matter of 2 years. I overdosed and had to be brought back a few times, and even after overdosing, you still go back to using because you know that you're going to get sick once you come down. It's a horrible, horrible drug, and it's a horrible cycle that you get stuck in. And that's the thing on reservations too. Really, where's the healthcare? Where's the access to healthcare? Where's the access to like MAT programs, right? When you go, like me and my friend Jenny, we both work at AICDC at Homeward Bound. And what we do is we are also on the board for Southside Harm Reduction. We can bring up harm reduction tools up to, let's say, Red Lake, just an example. But we would have to sneak it in there because it's not widely accepted. There's such stigma around even just naloxone, right? Narcan. There's such a stigma even around Narcan and bringing that on the reservation that how can we even start with talking about even clean like needles or like, other works that will help drug users reduce like STDs and bloodborne illnesses. So there's a lot of work to do.
And Dr. Hayden, how important is community to recovery within the Black culture?
In recovery in our community has always been a lasting piece. It's called the village. The community is the village. And where there's help needed in the village, we are there. And that's what I have tried to do with Turning Point and other people who are working now in the community, because they see it as a village. And so therefore, when you think of mothers, fathers, cousins, and things of this nature, that's all is the village. So when I went through treatment, and the only place I could go in many cases where the village was, let's say it was a bar. There were people in the bar that could go to the bar and drink responsibly. But the village knew that I was not going to drink responsibly. So the village protected me. There was a conversation in the village, just as in the community, there are what they call barbershops. And in the barbershop, there's a lot of information. So what we've done at Turning Point, we go in the barbershop with HIV, AIDS, we go in there with chemical health and things of this nature, because you have a listening audience in the village. And so that's what we are. Turning Point is the village.
And so how do you, gentlemen, get upstream from this issue? What do you do to try to start getting upstream from this? What is some of the work that you yourselves are doing and that you know is being done statewide?
Maybe I'll jump in. Again, I think understanding that opioid dependence or addiction is not a choice. It's not a moral issue, that it is a physiologic thing that happens to someone's brain. And so I'll come back to that education in a moment. Number two, understanding what it takes and what medications are out there to help the brain function normally. That's a big key area. And then finally, all the area between that moment when someone is actively struggling to no longer using, there's a whole area that people live in the middle. And that's where we need to be focusing to educate and improve lives. Talking about someone who needs to make it to a clinic appointment to receive a medication that helps the brain function normally, a medication like a buprenorphine product like Suboxone. You need to be able to sleep through the night safely without fear of having your body or your property stolen to be able to make it to that appointment. You need a phone to make it to your appointment. You need a place to receive hygiene so you can sit in a waiting room and not be eyeballed by security. You need to then have identification and transportation to a pharmacy, right? There are a lot of things that I, for one, have taken granted until mentors like Jase have kind of helped open my eyes, that making it to an appointment, that is a barrier for many people at that moment.
You know, so I work obviously at Homeward Bound. So we are, like I said, a 24-hour shelter, first of its kind for Native Americans, like Native American specific. And I believe right there is kind of getting ahead of the issue there, that in a unique way that's needed for my community. And that is simply having a place where people can feel accepted without judgment and without stigma. Stigma holds us back so much. Like Dr. Ryan said, or Dr. Kelly, you know, going to even a doctor's appointment is a big deal for a lot of our relatives, because they have been treated some sort of way when they go to a clinic, when they try to get to an appointment. And setting a time for them is huge. Trying to get somebody to get to an appointment on time is a task, especially when they do not have a clock, they don't have a phone, they don't have any way to get there. So luckily, Homeward Bound is a wonderful opportunity for a lot of people, a lot of relatives in our community that need services, because we have been working with Coop Clinic, we've been working with NAC, we've been working with NACTU, we've been working with a lot of different community agencies. And what they'll do is they'll bring their services into the center. So say I have somebody who needs a Rule 25, so an assessment for treatment. I can call somebody and have somebody come into the center. We need somebody who's going into heroin withdrawal and they're getting sick and they need to see somebody right away. I can call Healthcare for the Homeless. Healthcare for the Homeless is there. Get them on some mat, get them to feeling better just so they can even just think. and even just relax. There's a lot that we can do to get in front of it. And what I like to do personally for me is I'm pretty open about my journey. I'm pretty open about where I've been and what I've done in order to help the clients the best that I can. And I'm not ashamed of my journey. And that's a big thing, is taking away stigma and getting the word out about, like, hey, these are people's like sons and daughters and uncles and aunts and moms and dads. They're in our culture, we're all related. So they're our relatives. I go every day to work to help my relatives. And that is such an amazing feeling. I want to tell everybody that I go to work with and that I'm at work, you're the reason why I wake up here. You're the reason why I'm here. And I know someday you can be sitting in this chair, because natives need to help natives. That's just, in my opinion, there is no other way, better way to get to a native than being another native and sitting at that desk and saying, hey, you can do it. Because I can go to treatment all day, or I can go to any other service, and who will be sitting across from me? More than likely it'll be a white guy or somebody not of my race. And so I think for me, getting out and being a positive community member, being out doing stuff like this right now, even though I don't want to do it, getting out and talking about this is how we get in front of it, and being a positive community member. Also standing up and sticking up for people who can't, right? So when I hear people talk about like stigmatic talking, when they're talking about our unsheltered or people who are in the cycle of addiction, I speak up. I talk about it. I say, hey, that's somebody's relative. Let's slow down here. Let's examine what we're doing here. Just getting the word out about help and just being on the front line. I think that is huge in itself.
Dr. Hayden, let's talk about your work. Your lived experience and has taken you to opening turning point. If you can, paint a picture for our listeners about what the Black communities are dealing with when it comes to substance use. And, is it more challenging to seek recovery, even though an organization like yours does exist? Or do you think the playing field has leveled a little bit?
It has not. And I'll tell you why. It's so interesting that when I started Turning Point 49 years ago, people were going to jail. And the reason I started Turning Point is to allow people to go into treatment. That's like going to the hospital and you get shot looking for deer or rabbits and things of this nature, and you go in the hospital because accidentally you got shot and they put you in jail for being a hunter. My point is that Black people was not going to treatment, therefore something had to happen, and that's how Turning Point started. We started because we had a disease, we had a health issue, and no one saw it that way except people who look like the same people who was in recovery and those kinds of things. We know that recovery didn't start in the Black community, except for someone in the community, and in my case, African-American people saying, we got to do something for that boy or girl, etc. I took that same legacy lesson and started Turning Point the same way. I did not have to have the county or anyone else to give me money to treat the people who look like me.
And I hear a lot about some great work that's being done. And I know you, Jase, have worked outside of the metro area with some of the reservations. We also know that this is not a problem that is unique to certain socioeconomic statuses. We've heard from affluent white folks who've lost their sons and daughters to an overdose as well. Does the work differ, let's say you are upper middle class, than it would if you are homeless, unsheltered, living on the streets?
Maybe, Jase, I'll chat briefly about my hospital experience, if that's okay. So, I'm also a hospital medicine doctor at the University of Minnesota, and I've been working for several years to try and improve the hospital experience for folks who use drugs. The hospital is a black hole if you are a drug user. I mean, you face bias, you face judgment, you face racism. But if you have someone who has never been taught to inject in a way to prevent infections, or doesn't have the resources to inject in a safe way, and they get a serious life-threatening infection where they have bacteria in their blood, at that moment, when they're in the hospital, as long as people are empathetic and treat you in a non-judgmental way, hopefully you'll stay in the hospital. But at the moment of hospital discharge, who is going to be more likely to be able to make it to resources? A person with family in the suburbs with transportation, or someone who is on the street without many resources? And so I think, yes, there is a huge discrepancy in accessing services.
So let's talk a little bit more deeply about getting upstream and what you think still needs to be done. What are some of the gaps, the bridges that need to be crossed?
For the Native community, I believe that one of the big things is just going to be talking about MAT programs, talking about addiction, talking about trying to get away from the stigma, even from...
Let me interject real quickly. I'm sorry. MAT is medically assisted treatment, just for our podcast listeners.
Sorry about that. I should actually say that. But yes, so MAT programs that help. They help out a lot, and I believe that there's a lot of stigma around them, and I believe that a lot of people kind of shy away from them, either that they didn't work when they first started them, or they have somebody that has been on them a long period of time, and they don't feel like somebody should be on methadone for years. I don't think that's right. Since working in the profession, I can let you know that these are wonderful tools. I would rather have somebody on methadone for a year or two than shooting up. It's what you do while you're on them. And I think we're missing a lot of education as far as how they work. And I think stigma is our biggest barrier, really. Stigma around use and stigma around people in recovery is our biggest obstacle to get over, in my opinion.
I'd agree. Stigma is just still having such a huge impact. But just, recently looking at numbers, so from June of 2019 to June of 2020 across the United States, there was almost 90,000 people who died from overdose. 70% of those were from people whose drug supply was tainted with illicit fentanyl, which is another important conversation to have in a moment. But the biggest rise in overdoses are in people who identify as Black or Indigenous. And then at the same time, less than 20% of folks have access to medications like Suboxone or methadone. The access to medications that can help people function normally without using their drug, that can help them be protected from overdose if they do use, are huge. What those numbers don't take into account is the number of people that are admitted to hospitals or die from bacterial infections, that if someone lived in another country where injection drug use doesn't have the same taboo as it does in our country, people are taught how to inject drugs in a way where they don't get these infections, right? So if we can prevent overdoses, and if we can prevent these infections, which are all 100% preventable, that allows time to get people the resources, the housing, et cetera, to then be first in better control of their drug use, and then if it's their goal, to not use. And so I think, again, it's access and education.
And that's a great segue to my next question, because we like to talk about how recovery is always possible if somebody is alive. Naloxone, which is also known as Narcan, is a life-saving substance that can reverse an opioid overdose. Now, access is increasing, particularly here in Minnesota. But do you guys think it's enough?
Well, I think more is needed in the village, in the community. I think it does a good job in the community, but it's like herd immunization. It's not enough, and enough people can't get it for it to work. And so you got rural, you got urban, and then you got the people of color, the village. And so therefore we've got to get it more out, and the communication for different types of products that will help people, that communication has to be broadened. But let me just say this: where there is money, the people want to be in charge. Although you have the village and you have those people in the community that knows what's happening. But if you don't have the dollars, it doesn't work. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's many things out there can help us more, but you can't say, I have the money and this is what I want you to do, and if you don't do it, then the money dries up for you.
I personally can say from doing my own harm reduction and doing my own outreach with, like I said, my friend Jenny, I always want to give her credit too, that no, like we need more programs to talk about Narcan, definitely a more education to take away the stigma that keeps people away from learning about it or even hearing about it. I think it's ridiculous that some reservations do not allow it or kind of shy away from harm reduction being brought onto their reservation for fear that it will bring drug use, like it promotes drug use. And in my eyes, it does not promote drug use. It promotes being aware, aware of what you're doing and aware of what the community is going through. And it helps people use in a safer way. I just a quick little blurb. I can let you know that definitely from outreach and from people doing harm reduction, it saved my life. It kept me away from contracting any bloodborne diseases. I'm here because of people doing outreach and using harm reduction as a tool. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here. So I do believe that there's a lot more work to be done, and it's a lot more than just getting Narcan out to the community. There's education that goes along with that, along with other supplies. So yeah.
And then, I think if we take, the COVID-19 pandemic and what that's done to people using drugs, right? Number one, more people are using drugs in isolation. You can't Narcan yourself. All right. And so that's a huge problem. Then we think about what, COVID-19 has done to the drug supply. The drug supply was tainted with fentanyl beforehand, but now, someone who is dependent on opioids and can only afford what they can buy off the street, which traditionally the cheapest opioid on the street was heroin. Well, now it's not heroin. It's much more potent illicit fentanyl, or a version of fentanyl that high up drug distributors get in the mail and is very potent. And users have no idea how potent it is with each bag that they get. And so that is really making things much more dangerous and much more complicated. We talked already about the barriers of getting into care, right? If someone doesn't have a phone, how can they make it into an appointment? If someone lives, 50 miles from a clinic, our state allows phone visits, right? And so if outreach workers are empowered when they are with folks to have relationship with providers willing to provide medications via phone visits, I think that helps a little bit.
How important is community support? Where does that play in with the access to naloxone and the medically assisted treatment? How can that help somebody who's using, or for the family members, loved ones of somebody who's using?
Well, it'd be a lot more easier to go down to the community center to go get your Narcan or go get your needles or go get your ties if it was accepted and you didn't think that you were going to be looked at, right? If I'm thinking on a reservation, right? So that's a whole day in a reservation, having somebody come through and have a clinic open, to have harm reduction supplies there. That's like a whole task. Like, I think something that we take for granted here in the cities, like I can go down to IBTF right now, go grab a box of needles. I can go call Southside Harm Reduction and get needles brought to my house. You know what I'm saying? And like Dr. Ryan Kelly was saying, like down there or up there, all around us, it's not that easy. So, and then if you think about it, like, okay, yeah, so that's a phone call. And let's just make sure that they can make a phone call and that they can get their needles and like Narcan and they'll be set. Well, then still after that, where's the community support for that? You need community support along with that service in order for it to work. If you don't have the community support and the actual knowledge and the teachings of that, then how is it going to work? It's not going to work, because you're going to have everybody looking at you and talking about you and saying, Jase, did you know Jase shoots up? He went and got a whole bunch of needles. I seen him down at the clinic. That is a big barrier on reservations, period, is going to the doctors because of the lack of respect for HIPAA and because people talk. These are small towns and people talk, and it's just the way it is. And I'm learning that more and more as I go and I get deeper into the field. The Native community, we talk and we will keep tabs on everybody. And I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. And even like my cultural sensitivity class or cultural competency class, they even talk about it. There's a whole section on dealing with the Native American population, right? we play by different rules, and it sucks, but that creates stigma. So like a simple trip to go pick up needles and go pick up some Narcan so I'm safe for the week and I can shoot up safely is a huge deal there.
And so, Jase, let's get a little bit beyond that. And what about for somebody who lives on a reservation who's in recovery? How important is community in that part of the equation?
Huge, huge. I mean, I think it'd be huge for anybody, but I think there on the reservation, we are pretty tight, and we do have a recovery community, and that recovery community is vital for many of us because it's tied into traditions and it's tied into ceremonies. A lot of our ceremonies, we can't participate if we're using or if we're under the influence. So a lot of the community members, when they're out in the cycle, they stay away from their culture, and that's a whole loss of culture, a whole loss of who they are. So when they come into it, especially like myself, like coming into it, you're refinding out who you are. You're finding out things about yourself that you didn't even know. And like all recovery, I'd imagine, in all cultures. I'm not saying ours is so special and mystical. I don't want to make it seem like that because I do believe that a lot of people think we're mystical. So I want to make sure to get away from that. We're just like everybody else. But I want to let you know our ceremonies do play a huge role in our recovery when we step into and we get onto the bread road. So it's a huge, and so without community, we'd be lost. And that's addiction in itself, right? Is a loss of community and loss of who you are. So that's what we're all searching for.
The CDC does have some messaging out there saying, do you know what's in your drug? Your dealer probably doesn't. So as we listen to these stories, Dr. Kelly and Jase, are you optimistic that we can start bringing these overdose numbers down?
I actually am optimistic about bringing the overdose numbers down because I believe that more and more people are being aware. And I believe that we're doing a good job on doing outreach and getting to the community that uses. And also the community itself, they talk to each other. That's going to be our biggest tool as far as reaching people that use drugs, is going to be talking to the actual people that do it. And I believe a major part of that is talking to them first and treating them like a person instead of like somebody that we're talking down to. Just having conversations with our community members over this and how to inject safely and how to the drugs that are out there and the things that are the ways to recover that are available to them. I believe that a lot of times we're talking about either just abstinence or just either you're using or it's abstinence. And I don't subscribe to that. I believe that there is a middle ground. I believe that there is harm reduction has a wonderful way of looking at that. And that's just meeting people where they're at, and any positive change that they can make, that's amazing.
You know, I work a lot with folks who worry that replacing an illicit drug with a medication that if they stop taking, they get sick from, isn't that replacing one addiction with another? Or is that all of a sudden putting you at the control of your medical provider? And there's trust issues with that. And so basically, someone who's dependent on opioids, what's happening in our brain? Well, our brain makes something similar to an opioid to help with, happiness, pain control, etc. In as short a time as 2 to 3 weeks of taking an opiate, be it prescribed from a provider, something you buy off the tree, it doesn't matter. Our brain changes and says, why am I making this for free? Why am I still making this? I'm getting it for free. And that part of the brain turns off. And in many, many people, that part of the brain stays off. Now, earlier, Jase mentioned, someone who is dependent on opioids, when they try and stop using, there's a period of withdrawal that is mind-blowingly difficult to get through. And I won't go into detail about what that's been described to me, but if someone's able to get through that week, which most people can't, but if they did, if their brain's pathway is still off, it's like every day waking up with the flu, right? You can't function. You've got no motivation. And that's why over 90% of people will relapse if they don't have access to medications like methadone or Suboxone.
And Dr. Hayden, let me ask you, do you think, seeing what you see and being, as active in the community as you are you optimistic at all that we can get upstream from this?
Only if you turn over the power that some people feel they need, because it's like if I could go into just a short piece The master loved his slaves, but they were still slaves. I'm optimistic only because I see the glass half full, but it's taken too long. It's taking too long for it to happen. So I'm optimistic, but at the same time, I'm concerned, very concerned.
And on that note, Jase Rowe, Dr. Kelly, Dr. Hayden, thank you so much for joining us and talking about this important topic. And to all of those who tuned in, we really appreciate it. And we hope you listen to all 5 from this pilot season. I'm Julie Bartke with the Minnesota Department of Health with this story from the field. Thank you for listening.